So today I wanted to talk a little bit about why I believe that women's mental health needs to be approached a little bit differently than it is right now. So just to state the obvious, I think that we need to remember that women are not just smaller men or like men in a smaller sized body. The reality is that there are really quite distinct biological differences. And the reality is that we actually present quite differently with our mental health problems. And in the last 2 weeks, I think I've literally had every possibility of mental health condition that I would normally see just come through my clinic's door. And it really has made me think a lot about how we approach these things and how we need to approach them differently. And the reality is, unfortunately, for years, most research has been carried out on men only and then extrapolated in terms of dosage to potentially giving women a slightly lower dosage of medication. And so when I think about the things that I see in women, for example, eating disorders. So eating disorders are twice as likely in women as they are in men. And actually, eating disorders are a lot more common than you might think. So over your lifetime, 9% of women will have an eating disorder. And in fact, we think that's probably underestimated because there's a lot of people who have undiagnosed eating disorders and about 4% of men. If we also think about other issues that women may present with, there's often mental health issues related to hormonal cycles. So we often see women with mood disturbances related to their menstrual cycle. We see women after the birth of a baby with risks of postnatal depression. And then we also see a large increase in mental health conditions, anxiety and depression. And even we've had patients with psychotic style illnesses presenting around the time of the perimenopause and menopausal transition. And then we also see a group of women who were not diagnosed as children as having ADHD, probably because they didn't quite fit the mold of the classical hyperactive boy jumping off the sofa or, climbing onto roofs, that stereotypical case that we actually rarely do see in either boys or girls, to be honest. It's not usually quite as frank as that, but often girls have a misdiagnosis, and more I have women presenting in their 30s, 40s and 50s where they're just feeling like they can no longer maintain the status quo and their mental health is deteriorating. We also know that women are much more likely to have symptom of anxiety throughout their whole life. But again, I definitely see anxiety creeping in an awful lot in my perimenopausal and menopausal patients. And then if we think about another group of women that we see, is that unfortunately the reality is that girls are much more likely to be exposed to violence, childhood sexual abuse as children and teenagers than males are. And therefore we see the implications of that. And that can be in terms of medical conditions such as reactive depression, or personality disorders or complex trauma. So all in all, we definitely are seeing different presentations in women. We know that substance abuse disorder, for example, is more common in men, and men often present more with violent or antisocial behaviours, where classically women tend to have more hidden behaviours. Now, obviously, that's not always the case. We also do see an increase in suicidality. So certainly if we look at younger age groups, teenagers and young adults, females are more likely to self-harm. But if we also look further down that age spectrum, we also see that again in that perimenopausal and postmenopausal period, we see not only a spike in depression, but also in suicidality. So why is there such a difference, and why is it a problem? Well, to be honest, we don't know. We definitely have an absolute lack of research in this area. And I'll talk a little bit later about why there are some exciting things happening, but why there needs to be a little bit more. But what we do know is that there's an influence of hormones on mental health that we probably have really neglected to consider or understand. And whenever we step back, and whenever even I step back as a doctor, it sort of surprises me that we haven't thought about it more, given that, we do see people with really struggling with their mood just before their period, or we see women with dreadful reduction in mood after they've had a baby. And again, we see this increase in depression around the time of the perimenopause. And yet we have struggled to really put that together and think about, should we be using hormones in some shape or form to treat these women? And it's only really in recent years that this has started to be talked about. I think we also have to acknowledge that we now know that the stress response, so the physical stress response within females, is different to males. So we know that that sort of brain adrenal response to stress is probably a bit blunted in women in comparison to men. And we don't really understand what the implications of that are and how that impacts how we deal with ongoing stress. And we all know it's talked about quite frequently, the amount of ongoing stress that everyone's under today in society. But the reality is that it would seem that women are particularly have an expectation of, employment, job, satisfaction and, doing their best in their job, but also having children and raising them really well and having a, very smooth running family and home environment, and also maintaining friendships and exercise and healthy eating and socializing and all the things. So there's definitely a lot of societal pressure on all of that. And I think whenever we just take a little step back, we have to understand that women have monthly and lifespan changes and variations within hormonal patterns that men don't have. They tend to have a more steady state of hormones. And we really need to be taking this into consideration and how it's influencing how we are treating women with various health conditions. So as I said, I do think that hopefully the tide is turning, but we definitely need more pressure put on people within government, etc., to fund more research and just to get these conversations out there. It is societal change we need with regards to things like domestic violence, violence towards children, childhood sexual abuse, and how culturally various countries and communities deal with that. But we also need there to be funding, and more funding very, very specifically into female mental health and how perhaps we should be developing new treatments, new technologies and new ways of performing therapy, which really acknowledge that very clear gender difference that we're seeing. And what I'd love to do is have a shout out to Professor Jayashri Kulkarni. She's actually episode 2 of my podcast. It's been one of our most popular episodes. She speaks so very clearly and connects so well for any of the listeners to understand how hormones are related to the various mental health challenges that women have. And she is this amazing, incredible, not only researcher, but clinician who is at the forefront of the Her Centre in Melbourne, which we're really, really lucky to have in Australia, and is absolutely at the worldwide forefront of this real push for female-specific research into women's mental health. So I think part of the attacking any problem is to acknowledge it, acknowledge the differences and acknowledge the shortcomings. And I think it's just good to get it out there that the reality is that women do have different mental health conditions. We probably need to be approaching them in a very gender-specific way for a lot of the time. And we need to be thinking outside the box and not jumping always to pop someone on like a classical antidepressant, whenever actually what we really should be thinking about is, for example, their hormones, or we maybe need to be thinking of ways that psychological therapies, etc., are really more geared specifically to the gender-specific issues or childhood traumas that women may well have had in the past. So if you'd like to know a little bit more about the Her Centre, they have a fabulous website. You can definitely support them and encourage your local representative to support them financially so they continue their amazing work. And if anyone is really interested, Professor Jayashri Kulkarni has this amazing conference coming up in October in Melbourne. I attended it last year myself. I have to say I've attended lots of conferences over the years, and this was probably my most favourite conference. There were people from all sorts of walks of life, all types of industries. It was just a really amazing experience with lots of wonderful ideas and lots of things in the pipeline to work together to help women not only at home but in the workplace and in every avenue of life to improve women's mental health. I hope that helps. If anything that I've talked about today you feel has impacted you, then I would suggest that you chat first and foremost with your GP and we'll take it from there. When I started this podcast back in December 23, I knew that I was lucky enough to have amazing conversations with various health professionals across all facets of medicine and allied health. And I knew that you would probably really enjoy being a fly on the wall to hear what we talked about. And that's how the podcast was born. And what you probably don't know is that this is a bit of a passion project. We don't have any sponsors or funding. And without your help, we won't be able to continue bringing you these great guests. So if you can please spread the word about the podcast, share it with someone who you think might benefit from the conversation that you've just listened to, or if you can leave us a review or a comment, it would mean the absolute world, because that actually helps the podcast spread further and get more people to hear our message and hopefully allow us to invite bigger and bigger guests onto the show. And I would so appreciate you helping me back. Thank you. This podcast and any information, advice, opinions, or statements within it do not constitute medical, healthcare, or other professional advice. Information is provided for educational and entertainment purposes only. If you have any health concerns, always consult your doctor.